Dr. Arthur Kennedy, let's check if you are also as positive like the other, elder statesmen who were part of this process and have been saying this is good, except sometimes we are familiar with this path. Implementation, it's always our problem.
Yes. Happy Independence Day to all Ghanaians. They say that we celebrate our and if we haven't achieved much in life. So we should celebrate Independence Day. But I think it's an interesting conversation. Our problem, Samson, is that we refuse to call things by their proper names. Kofi Bento makes an excellent, impassioned case about whether anything is new and all that, and then he falls into the same trap by saying that the vice president, who was the economic guru for the government that abysmally failed, was a great candidate. I mean, that is part of our refusal to call things by their proper names. I am reminded of the story of a guy who got married and after some time, nothing was happening and the elders called him and they said, "Where are the children?" He said, "I'm talking to my wife." And the old man said, "Man, there is a way of producing children. You can't produce children by just talking to your wife. There are things you need to do." I think we've heard a lot of these things, and I'm glad that it was brought up.
The vice president didn't call the shots. He was not he was not the president.
Yeah, but he was the vice president who was brought in because he had economic news. The president said, "I'm on board because he's an economic genius." So at the end of the day, you can't tell us that the economy failed and you knew nothing about it. You were only there blanket. But let me go on.
We understand, for example, the vice president was against e-levy, but the government went ahead to implement it. What could he do?
Well, and what could he do? Have you ever heard of Ujinja Odinga, who resigned as vice president of Kenya because he disagreed with the direction of the governance? And to get back on strike, you realize Donald Trump has been in office for less than John Mahama has been in office. But it seems like he's been there. Every day, he's raining actions, good and bad, on the people. Governance is about doing. And my point was that the Senche engagement and the report, I went back and read it. It sounds very, very similar to the National Economic Dialogue. And part of it is that a lot of the players are the same. They are the same people who have been saying the same things. The problem with Ghana is that we don't want to do things. We kind of tinker around the edges of problems. And the spokesperson for the NDC says, "Oh, the details are coming." Yes, but the highlights tell us your priorities.
On this platform, if I may clarify this before I forget, Professor John Gachi is not here speaking for NDC. He was part of the organizers of the forum.
Okay.
Right, thank you.
The organizer of the forum says the details are there, and a lot of these things people are saying are in the details. It's true, but the communique highlights your priorities. So if something is important enough, it will be in your communique. There was nothing about fighting corruption. I think fighting corruption is an indispensable pillar to turning our economy around. So even if you were listing three things, it should have been there in blazing headlines. I haven't even talked about the action. I never heard any discussion about the role of the diaspora. For over the last decade, they've been sending every year more money than we get in foreign direct investments. And we didn't discuss the role of the diaspora in our economy. There was nothing on moral enforcement of the country, because most of our problems are moral. The difference between right and wrong, principle, calling things as they are. They are talking about increasing revenue. Every year, Parliament gets people to line up to ask for tax annulment, tax forgiveness. Every year they do that, even while officially we are saying we are not raising enough revenue. How are you going to raise enough revenue when every year you are forgiving taxes? And there are state-owned enterprises. I can tell you, in 2000, one of the first detailed conversations I had with Boache Jakons on state-owned enterprises, the World Bank had prepared a report on Ghana's state-owned enterprises with solutions. That was a quarter of a century ago. And we're still talking about them. We need to understand that governance is about doing things. And the good professor talked about, there's going to be another dialogue on education, how many dialogues are we going to have? I am hopeful, but frankly, I am getting less and less optimistic by the day. We need to start doing things. What are we going to do about corruption? Without solving corruption, nothing else will work. What are we going to do to bring the diaspora to the table? If we don't do that, then they will lose interest in our development. And I tell you, from where the diaspora come, there are more people behind them, our children, who will give us 50 and 60 years of commitment going to second and third generations if we do things right. What are we going to do? For example, when was the last time a president fired a cabinet minister for corruption? When was the last time Parliament refused to pass the budget for a ministry because auditing showed that there was malfeasance? Why is it that we talk about state-owned enterprises and President Mahama, unfortunately, has already set the predicate for the state-owned enterprises continuing to fail? Because we have appointed people to them based solely on cronyism without reforming their boards and bringing transparency and other things that would be the foundations of turning them around. And as for privatization of ECG, that people think is a solution. Here in North America, most electricity companies are not privatized because most states think that things like electricity and health and other things might be too important to subject to the tender mercies of profiteering or profit and losses. So that is not a panacea to all problems.
So you're seeing the president being slow compared to, as it is, Donald Trump, and in action almost every day, and like you said, good and bad, because some of the things he's doing, he himself is beginning to reverse some of them because they are biting. Listen to the MPs, just a couple of them, and tell me if the president is not, in fact, signaling correctly, because it does appear there's a groundswell of the society that suggests that the president is doing right.
Mr. Speaker, it is only under this government that when Bawumia digitalizes in Samanfo, Eji Kronufa, you digitalize to bring forth ghosts at national service. That is what your digitalization is about. Mr. Speaker, Bawumia Bako in Samanfo Bebre. Mr. Speaker, we live in a country where after 8 years, some people cannot show us a completed functioning hospital. All they have are uncompleted projects and at various stages of completion. We have been hearing various stages of completions till 2017. When are you going to complete them? Of course, Bawumia Bako uncompleted projects be brave. But Mr. Speaker, when you leave an economy that is struggling to pay its debts, you want us to invite you to a banquet? An economy where your debt strategy was to borrow recklessly, default in payment, and declare bankruptcy. Do you want the president to come smiling when he's delivering this gloomy picture that you have given him? If that amounts to lamentation, then so be it. Reckless to the point of finding it difficult to understand. And when you decide to put a stop to their recklessness, they call you a terminator. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately for them, the man who inherited their mess is a ruthless terminator. Mr. Speaker, John Mahama is a terminator of ghosts at NSA. I remember you were the information minister when you were trying to educate me on what is called Sumurai bond, Panda bond, Century bond. Mr. Speaker, these are the people. They were experts in bonds. When you ask Kojo, he said, oh, this is Sumurai bond, it is in Japan. They knew every corner where they were giving loans. Panda bond. Kojo, are they still giving the panda bonds? They said something was called century.
Three major things that I want to draw the government bench's attention to. Number one, stop the propaganda. You have won the election already. You don't need to do more propaganda. The propaganda will not create jobs. It won't put food on the tables of people. It won't put clothes on the backs of people. Rather, bring your governance programs. Till date, we don't have a single definition for the 24-hour economy program. Everybody you talk to has a different definition. Program Bako, definition bebre. Program Bako, definition bebre. Spend time doing less propaganda and more time bringing your governance programs so that Parliament can assist you and work on it.
Look at our public debt. They inherited a public debt of 120 billion Ghana cedis. And I remember distinctly that President Akufo-Addo stood to your right in this house and declared that the 120 billion Ghana cedi debt was unheard of. At the last reckoning, Mr. Speaker, our public debt stood at 721 billion Ghana cedis. Even then, Mr. Speaker, it was because they denied 1.3 million Ghanaian bondholders of the rights to earnings on their bonds. Mr. Speaker, the domestic debt exchange program, as Mr. President rightly noted, is the harshest economic policy in the history of Ghana. Mr. Speaker, these indices point to one fact, that the Akufo-Addo-Bawumia administration have been the worst managers of our economy by far and away. And there can be no dispute about it. Ghanaians have lived through the worst economic crisis in a generation. Ghanaians have lived through the worst economic crisis under the Fourth Republic, if not in the entire history of Ghana. Mr. Speaker, since the year 2020, or immediately after the elections of that year, the Ghanaian economy has been in a tailspin. For the first time in decades, a Ghanaian government defaulted on debt payments. When President Mahama was leaving power in January 2017, Ghana could fulfill its debt obligations. At a point, our debt to GDP ratio under the MPP leapfrogged to 104%. It meant that if theoretically we were to pick all of our GDP and pay our debt with it, we will still require another 4% to do so. It is the worst in our history under the Fourth Republic. Mr. Speaker, the budget deficit is the greatest indicator of economic prudence, because the fundamental principle of economic management is that you cannot live beyond your means. Sure. Even President Mahama stated boldly that in the event that he was elected, he will work with 60 ministers. This compelled our colleagues on the other side to immediately promise to work with 50 ministers. Mr. Speaker, these are the same people who defended to the hilt the appointment of 125 ministers. Mr. Speaker, it will interest you to note that the worst economic outcomes that this country has seen emanated from their performance between 2017 and 2020. After that point, all they did was to try to patch up for the wrongs of 2020. That terrible economic performance was brought about by the biggest government in our history of 125 ministers. That means that you don't need a legion of ministers to be able to manage the country properly. Now, Mr. Speaker, I use myself as an example of the savings that are going to be made by having a reduced government. My colleague on the other side, and my friend, Honorable Ponkuma, who, by the way, is my constituent also, used to head a ministry called the Ministry of Information. Mr. Speaker, that ministry had 76 people working there to manage government information. Mr. Speaker, as I speak to you, it is myself, a deputy, and 5 other people who now manage government information. Mr. Speaker, if you move from 123, 125 ministers to 60 ministers, Mr. Speaker, that means that you are going to buy 60 less Land Cruisers.
Forgive us, we're looking for a specific sound, but we had to go round about it. Forgive us about that. Dr. Atta Kennedy, people are talking about cutting down on the cost of government and so on, and that the signals are showing, including just how the 68th Independence Day celebration was observed.
I mean, those are valid points. And I think that is why I say that I am hopeful. But more needs to be done. You know, I think that talking about the election being over, the president's information person sounds like he was really litigating the campaign a little bit. The campaign is over. I think at this stage we should be doing accountability and executing. You know, all these people, you know, I saw all these charts about Bank of Ghana building with estimates that have tripled. Nobody is asking questions. We're talking about banking reforms that led to closure of some banks. We need accountability. Accountability as in putting people in the dock to answer questions. Why was this done? Why was that done? And at the end of the day, we must punish some people. It sounds like, I mean, we like Yokagari, but we don't want to see the making of Gari. You know, we need to do things, and I wish the president well, but I have a fear that in the end, we're going to do a lot of talking and find out in 4 years that most of the people who ran the country into the ground were never asked to account for their misdeeds. Okay. And that will really be sad, because it will just signal to future leaders that they can do the same thing. And I can tell you, sadly, that in 4 years' time, we're going to find out that this kind of corruption and others we are decrying, some of them are happening even from members of ORA, you know, and that is unfortunate. My counsel to the president is that talk is good. He talks well. His speech at the National Economic Dialogue was very good. It was heartfelt. But a president's legacy is based on things he does, not just on things he says. He needs to do things. Okay. And by the way, you look at how they are talking about the National Economic Dialogue. The government says our coffers are empty, but they are offering salary increases. You know, so if our coffers are empty and we are offering salary increases, how are we going to end up funding those salary increases? So these things have become very familiar, you know, complaining about state-owned enterprises and funding them, you know, but the same things that we complain about, we just wait for a decent interval and we go back and do them. Those people who spoke at the National Economic Dialogue were very good people. I've read K.Y. Amoakun's book about his autobiography, very good book. People he's been
on this for a very long time.
Absolutely. But the problem with the elder statesmen and others is that they get to a point where they don't want to offend anybody, you know. So we should listen to them sometimes, but I'm just saying you can't make omelets without breaking eggs. And I think that we need to be breaking eggs.
Okay. Thank you very much. Dr. Tony Edu.